When you're a child star, what does that really do to you? It's a question that many have asked, especially as we've seen many young talents from various eras go from the top of the world to the bottom of the gutter in no time flat, with many wondering how it all could have gone so wrong. Even in the days of old Hollywood and the music industry, this isn't a new thing, as the tale of Ricky Nelson will tell you. He was born the son of Ozzie and Harriet Nelson and was destined for great things from the start of his life, just because of their influence. Yet as time went on, his story began to reveal the darker side of celebrity life, and that is before you talk about the infamous death that he had that many are still trying to piece together today. We'll break it down for you. Be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. 6. The early life and times of Ricky Nelson. Let's start off at the beginning, shall we? It really is important to note how his parents influenced the early life of Ricky Nelson. Born to two of the biggest stars of the early entertainment era, Ricky's parents, Ozzie and Harriet Nelson, had one of the biggest radio shows around well before the period of television took off. Then, when it came time for the transition to television, the parents weren't afraid to use their kids as part of the act, even blurring the lines at times between a real life and the acting one that they lived. As a result of this, Ricky basically lived his life in front of the camera, within studios and recording booths, and so on. Family Time was basically just the Nelsons trying to come up with the next plots for the episodes they recorded or filmed. As a result, by the time he was old enough, Nelson wasn't just a star of the TV show his family created. He was one of the leading stars and one of the main attractions for young audiences due to his good looks and natural presence on camera. He was the early definition of a teenage heartthrob, and that would lead to one of the biggest things in Nelson's life, for better and for worse, the arrival of his music career. Music had been a part of his family's work in its own way, but Nelson wanted to try and do something on his own, and so he did a cover for the title I'm Walkin', and people were astounded by how good it was. Records flew off the shelves, and that gave rise to a new path for Nelson in more ways than one. It proved that he was far more than just the next Nelson family star, but a star of his own making. And this was just the beginning of things for him. 5. Nelson's star on the rise. Once it became clear that there was money to make off Ricky Nelson's voice, both his parents and others came in to help make him a star even further. Ricky's character on the TV show would sing and even debut songs in episodes to help keep both Ricky and the show relevant. He would go on to make big-name hits, including It's Late and the all-time classic Hello, Mary Lou. What's important to note is that these tracks were coming during a time when rock and roll was starting to burst in, and people didn't know exactly what to think of it, or even if the world should attempt to handle it. If that sounds familiar, it's because just about every new phase of music have had that kind of logic attached to it over the years, including punk, metal, hip-hop, rap, and so on. Ricky and rock and roll were just one part of that very long story. The difference between him and, say, Elvis Presley was that Elvis was doing things that were deemed controversial, such as his gyrating hips and his love-filled lyrics left people all shook up. In contrast, while Ricky was rock and roll in his own right, he was the side of it that was meant to appeal to families, in part due to how he had grown up in front of their eyes and had that clean-cut style that would make him feel less radical than others who were trying to take the genre to unknown heights. It also didn't hurt that Nelson was on television pretty much every week, introducing his style of music to the world during a time when there weren't that many other things on television to watch. This was a period when families would revolve their lives around certain shows so that they could enjoy it all together, and each new episode of their favorite show was a true highlight of the family's week. And for young teens, they couldn't wait to see Ricky Nelson again because they idolized him in all the ways one could at that time. Of course, the irony of this is that even with all that he had done and would do, the continued attempt to have fame would shape Ricky Nelson in a way that many didn't expect or even want, depending on how you looked at it. 4. The continued battle for success. As time went on, certain cracks in the persona that was crafted for Ricky Nelson began to show, and it all started with his family and their influence on him. Like we said, the Nelsons were big deals in radio and television during the earliest days of entertainment, with them using their own family and adventures to paint the next fictional adventures they would do on screen. The problem was that this was basically a 24/7 thing for Ricky, and that meant that his childhood wasn't really a childhood at all. Everything he did was basically for his family and its success, and even when he went into the music genre, his family used that to try and elevate themselves even further, while trying to control every aspect of Ricky's life. including his money. That became a problem as his early life went on, because despite selling millions of records, he couldn't live the life that he desired and dreamed of because of his parents' control over his early money and successes. Even in adulthood, when his star was still shining brightly, Ricky Nelson had to go far and wide to try and gain success on his own and attempt to get out from under the shadow that his parents had cast over him. To his credit, he could have easily coasted on all that he had done in the past, but instead, when musical styles started to change, he decided to delve deeper into what made him a star initially and put out more emotional and unique variations of rock music, and was later hailed as one of the contributing members to the country rock style that many would soon follow. He also went into the film industry and did other TV projects outside of his family's influence. In fact, during the later stages of his life, Ricky Nelson was quite literally all over television, as he took on a number of guest roles across all manner of genres, styles, and projects. He did everything from The Love Boat to Hardy Boys, Nancy Drew, and so much more. While some of it was to get money for his efforts, it also showcased his willingness to do all kinds of roles and not be afraid to try new things. Not to mention, he wasn't afraid to sing for some of these roles, and that allowed him to showcase many of his talents for all involved. In the later stages of his music career, he wrote what might arguably be his most important song, Garden Party, a track that made it to number 2 on the charts, despite his star long since dimming by that point. The importance of the song came from how Ricky wrote the lyrics and made it a story about himself in many ways. The line that remains strong to this day is, "You can't please everyone, so you gotta please yourself." It was a line that spoke to the many hidden struggles and traumas that Ricky Nelson was enduring in that period of his life. He was still bound by his past in many ways. Even when he was doing concerts that were meant to showcase his new music and tracks, many still wanted to hear the classics from when he was a young teen icon. Garden Party was the defiant track that punctuated how he felt and what life really meant to him in that stage. He knew that he couldn't make everyone happy, and that was something that he learned from his troubled life, but he learned how to make himself happy, and that was enough for a time. 3. Personal woes. We've already noted how Ricky was in conflict with his parents quite often, but let's dive into that a bit more, shall we? One of the biggest problems in Ricky's life was his desire to try out romances and learn things at his own pace, like many would expect of a young man or woman in the growing years of their life. The problem was that Ricky Nelson was Ricky Nelson, and he had parents who felt they knew better than him and wanted nothing more than to cultivate his image so that it transcended TV and music and would influence others along the way. That leans into the clean-cut style we referred to earlier when it came to his music career. Yet being the young man that he was, he didn't want that, and that put him at odds with his mother. Harriet felt that the young women he was bringing home to meet the Nelsons or was dating weren't the kind of person that he should be dating. What that meant, only she knew, but for Harriet, and by extension Ozzy, she felt that his ways were going to damage both his name, reputation, and the family's image. So what was Ricky Nelson to do? Well, he kept doing his own thing, trying his hardest to find his own path in life, even when his parents didn't approve. Yet the ironies continued, as his first marriage was to Chris Harmon, a perfect match in the eyes of the Nelsons, as the Harmons were family friends, royalty in Hollywood in their own right, and viewed as the perfect way for their families to come together and push their stars even higher into the sky. On the surface, everything was fine between Ricky and Chris, as the two went on to have 4 children, many of whom would go on into the entertainment industry via acting or music. However, when the spotlight wasn't upon them, the parents struggled with various pressures and being truly in sync with one another. Ricky's drive for success, especially in the later years of his life, led him to be away from home quite often, which put a lot of pressure on Chris to maintain the home and raise the children properly. They weren't the fit that their parents thought they were, and as a result, in 1982, after a long and brutal divorce, the two finally split. They did try and do their best for their children, to be clear, and even worked together to try and be a stable foundation for the 4 kids, even when the divorce was at its worst. They knew that just because they weren't good for one another didn't mean that they needed to make their children a part of their sadness. 2. The death of Ricky Nelson. Sadly, the tale of Ricky Nelson has one more element at play, and that has to do with his death in 1985. It all starts with Ricky, of course, who at this point in time had his own band that was going to be doing a New Year's Eve show in Texas. To get there, Ricky had a DC-3 plane that they would use. On board was Ricky, his new finance, Helen Blair, the 5 band members, and 2 pilots. Sadly, while near DeKalb, Texas, an issue occurred on the craft, and the plane suddenly caught fire. The only two to survive the event were the pilots, who were able to get out of the plane before the flames reached them. However, Nelson and everyone else on board perished, marking another tragedy of this nature in the industry. When something like this happens, especially for a celebrity, people start to point figures and demand answers. They would get them, but whether they accepted them was another story. Officially, the cause of the plane crash was due to the fire, which started in the cabin. Speculation from official investigators stated that it was likely a heater or similar item that malfunctioned and thus caused the fire. However, it was never fully confirmed what truly caused the spark that started the flames, and that's where the truth comes into play. 1. Was there more to it? Many years after the events of that crash, investigators and journalists decided to dive back into things and learned a rather sad truth about the plane crash. It was totally avoidable. Specifically, despite the person who owned the plane and the fact that there were many passengers on board with each ride it took, the plane wasn't maintained very well. In fact, there were many fixes that weren't really fixes at all. The heater, for example, was something that Ricky and others complained about in regards to it not working on multiple flights. Yet the pilots didn't maintain it properly and accidentally set it up for the catastrophe that was to follow. Just as bad was that the heater was next to materials that would instantly burst into flames should a fire break out, and the materials also created toxic fumes, which is likely what killed Ricky and the others on board while the pilots escaped. In the end, Ricky Nelson's death wasn't one caused by conspiracy, but by negligence, which arguably makes things even worse, as a truly talented person lost his life in a way that no one should die from. And that's all from the life of Ricky Nelson and how he went from one of the most prominent stars of his time to a man remembered tragically for his death, and the effects that celebrity life can have on a person. What do you think is the true legacy that Ricky Nelson left behind? Do you think that there is even more of his story left to be told, even after death? Do you think his life story should be told to help warn others of what happens when controlling influences and not enough self-control are shown? Let us know in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe, and we'll see you next time on the channel.